Hello, and welcome back to Constitutional Fraud. I'm your host, William Toppi. In today's chapter, we'll dive into the second part of my sentence, probation on the breaking and entering, which followed the serving of my initial sentence for larceny. In sharing my story, I hope to shed light on the profound flaws within our justice system. The injustices I faced, they aren't unique. They expose the cracks in the system that can affect anyone. My experience serves as a stark reminder that without significant changes and reforms, any one of us could find ourselves trapped in a web of legal complexities, facing the same harsh realities. Together, we can strive for a more just and equitable future where every voice is heard and every life is valued. The sentence I've been handed isn't a mere dot on the timeline of my life. It's a specter that looms far into the future, affecting every facet of my existence. In this episode, we'll unravel the early stages of probation, offering a glimpse into the daunting challenges I faced upon my release from prison. But this is only the beginning. Subsequent episodes like CPCS investigation and restitution hearing will shed light on the ongoing saga during this 2-year probationary period. And our journey doesn't end there either. We'll continue to explore the repercussions of this case with extended probation looming on the horizon. So join me as we navigate these uncharted waters where every twist and turn reveals a deeper layer of constitutional fraud. The day I stepped out of incarceration at Concord Farm, it marked the beginning of a new chapter tainted by the stigma this conviction had imposed. My mother-in-law was there to greet me, along with the bittersweet embrace of freedom after 2.5 years. I received my discharge papers, a mere $78 check, and a stern directive to report immediately to the probation department at the Lowell Superior Court. The consequences for failure to comply? A violation that could lead to an additional 10 years behind bars. Here, the probation sentence unveiled itself as a weightier burden than the initial committed sentence I'd already served. It carried not only the ominous shadow of a lengthy prison term, but also financial obligations, including a $65 monthly probation fee. However, I made my position clear to my first probation officer. I adamantly refused to shoulder these financial burdens. Moreover, I boldly asserted my innocence in the face of the crime and communicated my intention to trigger a CPCS investigation to unearth the truth about what had exactly befallen me. One of the conditions of my probation was having a registered address. However, this posed a unique challenge. I had no money saved due to the lack of rehabilitation opportunities that the fraud produced in my prison classification, as we discussed in our previous episode. Furthermore, a restraining order barred me from returning to the family home in Pepperell, and our rental property in Lowell was already occupied by tenants. With no other recourse, I found myself with a sole option, a homeless shelter in Lowell, Massachusetts. Stepping into the shelter, I registered my name, all the while making clear my recent release from prison and my probation status. The receptionist processed my information and handed me a booklet of shelter rules. It was then that I learned that the shelter doors, they locked promptly at 6:30 p.m. Missing this curfew meant forfeiting my spot, a lapse that could potentially spell a probation violation and a return to prison. My initial night at the shelter was less than welcoming. The shelter was in the midst of an emergency meeting addressing a bedbug issue. That night, I found myself on the top bunk, with the man below me coughing violently, causing the bed to shake. Sleep was elusive, and I lay there fully dressed, staring into the dark abyss. The shelter was filled with the discordant symphony of snoring and flatulence. At 6 a.m., abrupt fluorescent lights flickered to life above my head, and shelter personnel entered, shouting and prodding residents, "Get up and vacate the premises immediately." Disoriented and sleep-deprived, I was thrust into the cold streets, not knowing where to go or what to do. I felt completely unprepared for my re-entry into society, and the sensation of being lost was overwhelming as I wandered the streets of Lowell. I returned to the shelter at 6:30 p.m., only to find it was far from safe. I was taken aback by the diverse population it housed. There were groups of young, drug-addicted individuals who stuck together to eke out a precarious existence. In contrast, there were older residents who all appeared frail and sickly. Every night, the shelter was packed to capacity, and I started to receive dirty looks and overheard whispers. Some believed I didn't belong there, and I was occupying a bed that someone else desperately needed. This judgment weighed heavily on me, and I grew increasingly anxious about potentially getting into a fight. Such an altercation would lead to my eviction from the shelter and a probation violation. But worse still, it could land me in a new legal battle, facing charges of violence while on probation. These experiences marked the beginning of a profound paranoia that would haunt me for years. A constant dread of being falsely accused, held on high bail, and assigned counsel who saw me as less than human. The taste of freedom I've discovered was a bitter pill to swallow. After enduring a week of such circumstances, I found myself standing in front of my family's 3-story home, just a 5-minute walk from the shelter. As I stared at the house, a flood of memories came rushing back, reflecting on how my family had started out right there in that house. It was then that my now ex-wife's cousin, who resided on the first floor, where I once lived with my own family, he spotted me and invited me inside. He prepared breakfast and he allowed me to use the shower. The overwhelming sense of gratitude I felt during this simple act of kindness was tempered by a lurking sense of shame. This shame had been ingrained in me during my time at the Plymouth County Jail, where the meager rations and persistent hunger had become constant companions. My wife's cousin extended his generosity by inviting me to stay with him, his wife, and their young son. With their support, I promptly informed my probation officer of my new address. Then, a significant day approached when my children came to visit me. My son had grown significantly since the last time I saw him, and my daughter had transformed into a young woman. It was an awkward reunion, filled with the complexities of emotions. I was indeed a broken man, struggling to reconnect with the pieces of my life. Christmas arrived, and with it came the stark realization that I felt out of place within this young family I was staying with. The holiday season also rekindled dark memories of my arraignment and sentencing, both of which had occurred during the Christmas period. As the new year began, my mother-in-law provided me with a cell phone. I spent more time with my children, who celebrated my 48th birthday alongside me in February. 2 days later, the restraining order that had kept me away from the family home was set to expire. The invitation to return to our family home in Pepperell, where it all began, was extended to me. Now, I was back to where I had been when I was initially summoned to court and arrested on the subsequent charges. Back in the family home, I resided with my son, my daughter, and mother-in-law, while my ex-wife moved back into the house with the man who worked at the Billerica County Jail. However, the circumstances were markedly different. I was now a twice convicted felon, pressured into pleading guilty to the theft of children's clothes, toys, and someone's mother's remains in an urn. I had transformed into a broken man, burdened by an ever-present fear of everyone and everything. When I visited my probation officer to inform him of my new living arrangement, he shockingly accused me of violating the terms of probation by breaking the restraining order. I was taken aback. I explained that the restraining order had expired and I had been invited home. To confirm the status of the order, he checked his computer and it ominously showed the order was still active. I was abruptly informed that I would be sent back to prison. Panic and despair set in. However, my probation officer called the area district court at my urging to verify that order's status, and to my surprise, they stated that the order was not active, that it had been inadvertently omitted from the system. It was a perilous mix-up that could have easily led to my arrest. This incident was only the beginning of a series of violations that incessantly loomed over me, threatening to send me back to prison for another decade. My next probation officer, Mr. Bowen, had jurisdiction over Pepperell, and he conducted monthly home visits to monitor my progress. This routine check always involved the awkward act of urinating into a cup while he observed the actual urine flow. On one occasion, the test appeared to yield peculiar results hinting at substances like magic mushrooms or something. In haste, he considered taking me into custody, but wisely chose to perform this test again, which ultimately confirmed that the results were negative. During this visit, Bowen also pointed out that I wasn't in compliance with my probation terms as I hadn't pursued the drug counseling evaluation as mandated. It seemed like navigating life post-conviction was becoming increasingly complex. I needed to renew my driver's license so I could comply with this order and was astounded to discover a hefty $500 fee for the renewal, which I simply couldn't afford. My mother-in-law had to shoulder the financial burden on my behalf, just like she did with the fees that were seized from my canteen account in prison. Furthermore, Bowen stressed the importance of finding employment, but here again, I confronted a formidable challenge, primarily stemming from the conviction. Bowen handed me the contact information for a landscaping company that he said was willing to hire ex-convicts. I managed to secure a job with this company in Lowell. However, my workdays placed me in the backyards of residential homes alongside two other convicts. One of them had served 8 years for a violent home invasion, while the other had been incarcerated for 8 months for housebreaking. It was the same crime I had been convicted of, but he had been apprehended at the scene with stolen property in his possession. In stark contrast to my situation, he negotiated a plea bargain that resulted in an 8-month committed sentence. I was left astounded by the disparity in our sentences. This environment was deeply unsettling. I lived in constant fear that if either of these men engaged in any unlawful activities during our work, I might be implicated simply because I was present, just like what had happened in my own case that had led to a 2.5-year sentence and the looming threat of 10 more years. The paranoia was overwhelming, and I eventually decided to leave that job, never truly escaping the specter of potential incarceration. I managed to secure employment through a temp agency which assigned me to a plastics factory in Townsend, a mere 5-minute drive from my home. I was on a 2-year work assignment with the potential for a permanent position when one opened up, contingent on my work performance. The job was demanding, and I was content since it was conveniently close. However, this conviction had already left an indelible mark on my life. I had developed a pattern of venturing out in public only when accompanied by family members. The fear of being alone in public spaces was paralyzing. On the rare occasions I had to venture out unaccompanied, I found myself constantly glaring in the rearview mirror for any signs of law enforcement. When anyone met my gaze, my reflex was to avert my eyes or look away, weighed down by the shame and apprehension of judgment. I reluctantly attended a drug counseling program in Lowell for evaluation, as mandated by my probation terms. After a few sessions, I was informed that I didn't meet the criteria for drug addiction and they wouldn't schedule any more appointments for me. This development marked the beginning of my second probation violation. I was ordered to appear in court for non-compliance with the conditions. I had to find another drug counselor who would take me. My search led to one in Fitchburg, where I managed to rectify the situation, sparing myself from a potential violation and an unwelcome return to prison. And now, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our sponsor. This episode of Constitutional Fraud is brought to you by the Massachusetts Probation Service, whose main goal is to keep communities safe and to provide people on probation with the rehabilitative tools they need to live a productive and law-abiding life. However, it's essential to highlight some of the challenges I encountered during my probation, which often were degrading and demoralizing. Now back to our episode. One of the conditions of probation involved calling a random automated system that determined whether your color was called for mandatory urine drug screenings. If your color came up, you had to promptly report and sign in. Once called, you would be escorted to a bathroom with mirrored walls and a mirrored ceiling. In a deeply embarrassing and humiliating process, you were required to expose your sex organ and urinate in a cup while a stranger observed the urine stream. The consequences of refusing to comply with exposing myself were severe and could lead to a violation and potential imprisonment. Unfortunately, complying with these procedures wasn't the end of it. My probation officer insisted that I undergo this process each time he visited me, essentially forcing me to expose myself in front of him. It was a degrading and uncomfortable experience that made the challenges of my probation even harder to bear. Even though I never tested positive, this act of forcing me to expose myself to strangers would continue for a year and 10 months of the 2-year probation, only ending after the restitution hearing. Another devastating effect of the stigma that this unjust and fraudulent conviction was my inability to form intimate relationships. Since my initial incarceration, I have never dated or engaged in any romantic relationships. It felt as if my manhood had been stripped away, leaving me isolated and emotionally scarred. Stay tuned for our next episode in this series, titled CPCS Investigation. In this upcoming installment, we will delve into the investigation I initiated in my pursuit of justice. I was hoping to file a Rule 30 motion seeking a new trial, or in my case, a fair trial. You'll be both shocked and amazed by the results of this investigation, carried out by 3 separate attorney investigators. These legal professionals assessed my claims and inspected the court's records, concluding that all of my claims were without merit, even suggesting that I should be denied appointment of counsel for any post-conviction motions, which I was. I will introduce you to these attorney investigators and explore their professional opinions on this matter. I'm your host, William Toppi, and I want to remind you that our relentless pursuit of justice begins with your support and engagement. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time,